Hi, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle, and today we're going to try and repair a Penn Beachmaster Series 155 saltwater fishing reel. This is one that I purchased from a fellow who grew too aged to fish and was looking to get rid of some of his surf tackle. So the 155 has been around a long time. I can remember buying one for my daughter about 30 years ago, so it's still there, and the good thing with this one is that parts are still available. So if there's any broken parts in the reel, we could go order them up. This one's been worked on before. I noticed before we even start because the star drag is on backwards. But short of that, you would expect over 30 years that they probably had some drag service if they were taking care of the reel. Otherwise, cosmetically, there's some flaws in it, but it seems to be okay, and I thought it would be a good example to show you how to disassemble a reel, check for any broken parts, replace those that might be needed, and in this case, it's an example of how to work with that dog spring assembly in the back of the reel. So we're going to start by taking off the handle assembly and the star drag. That's how you gain access to the business end of this reel to go do that maintenance. The handle is held on with the handle nut and the little stop screw. So let's start there. The stop screw sits in a little groove that holds that handle nut in place. We'll take that out with a screwdriver. I always keep a little parts tray. In this case, it's very simple. It's the bottom of a milk jug. But if you put all your parts in there, you know where to look for them on reassembly time. The handle nut comes off if you're using a Penn reel. You may have the wrench that came with it. I have an aftermarket wrench, a little bit more sturdy if you're working on them all the time. And this wrench also takes care of a 6/0 size nut in addition to the standard Penn nut. As you notice, I'm also wearing latex gloves. I like to do that because you never know what you're going to find inside this reel in terms of chemicals, and for the most part it keeps that stuff off your hands. At some point I may need to remove that as there's some small parts in here that are a little bit more difficult to work with when you have the gloves on. That's the downside. So we take the handle nut off. The next is the handle. As I mentioned, it's interesting, this number on the star drag always goes to the back side of the reel. That's how I know it's been worked on, but that's okay. It should have been worked on in the years that it is. So we'll take that off by reversing the threading. There's one more piece in here, which is a little ferrule that sits on the drag assembly. That's used for compression. Looking at that, we may have to replace the drag, so we'll take a look at that a little bit later. And then there's 6 side screws for this series. The procedures I'm following here are very similar if you're working on a long beach reel. The inside's going to be similar, so is the outside plates. The long beach is just the shorter. It's a stubbier, wider reel with higher capacity, but that one has also been around for a while. And that comes in a lot of flavors. It comes in the 60, the 65, 66, and 67 for the long beach. These procedures would work with the 60 and the 65. The 66 and 67 are almost identical to the Penn 4.0 reel, with the exception of the drags, which are and the metal jacketed side plates. So take these out. Now, a quick note on the reassembly when it comes to time. These 2 screws on the bottom that fit into the reel seat are shorter than the screws that go into the posts. So when you reassemble, you want to make sure you have the shorter screw going to the reel seat, the longer screw going to the post. Okay, so we took that off. This happens to have a plastic spool with it. No problem with the plastic spools. They're not as durable as the metal spools that you may find on some reels, and as a result you want to check to see if there's any cracks along the rims. From time to time that happens. And then we're on the inside of the side plate assembly on the gear side. To remove that, you take 4 screws out. The 2 screws on the top have partial threading and a smooth surface. That's because there's springs behind these. The two screws on the bottom are fully threaded, and you should remember that when you're going to go and reinstall these as well. I'll make a point of it again when it comes time to put these back together. And then one more. I just back these screws off till I can feel that the plate has moved through. It has. And then I always open up the reel this way. There's a screw, there's a dog assembly that has a small spring, or it's either a flat spring or a coiled spring, and this is the best way to do it so that you can retain that spring and not lose it. In this case, it's a flat metal spring, as you can see, and if you're a little bit reckless or not watching what you're doing, that thing can fly anyway, particularly the coiled springs. So I've just taken that out. You can see the difference here on the two screws, the partial thread and the full thread. Here's the main gear assembly. This is the anti-reverse dog spring. We're going to go put that in the parts bucket. And we're going to remove the free spool transition piece, the spool gear, and the collar, and then the underneath springs, so that we can fully lubricate that. So that simply comes off. The hook goes around the lever release. This is your spool gear and collar. These are the two springs that are the through springs that operate the free spool release. And there's another one of those screws that just came out. So first thing we want to do is check for dirt. There is some dirt in here, so I like to clean that one. My tool of choice for cleaning is a cotton swab. If it's really thick grease, look at that, there's a lot of thick grease. You may require several of them. That undoubtedly was one of the reasons why the spool was turning a little bit tight. And then once it's clean, simply some grease. In this case, I use Penn real grease for most of my work. And we're going to just grease that side bearing. And we're going to put a little grease on that free spool release there. Next up is to check the parts to make sure they're cleaned before you go partially reassembling this. I noticed that the collar for the spool gear has a lot of junk on it, so I simply use steel wool to clean that off. You can use a mild abrasive cleaner as well if you found that there was some particularly tough stuff to get off. One that I use is a Turtle Wax Chrome Polish, an automotive product, but it's fine. And then I'm going to put some more of that grease on the collar. And then I'm going to check the spool gear to make sure that's clean and not missing any teeth. If that's the case, it's fine. If there is some crud of that in there, you can use a metal brush to clean some of that out, but this one in this case is fine. So we're going to take the connecting pieces here, and we're going to go reassemble the front portion of this reel here. So the two springs go in, the carrier assembly goes on. Press down the carrier assembly, and then bring the transition piece for the carrier plate over. And that's how you reassemble that portion of the reel. Now this one, I'm going to check the gears on this. It doesn't look as if the drags, looks like the drags may need some service. So I'm just going to pull that out. If they don't need service, that's fine, but I'll show you how to do that anyway. So the main gear comes off in order to check the drags. That whole assembly pulls off. Make sure that the gear behind, the washer on the pinion gear is seated and proper, and then you can just pull the drags out or push them through in order to get a look at what we have here. In this case, these drags seem to be flexible, not brittle. They have been oiled, so okay. It looks like it's just had some prior greasing pushed out of it. So I'm going to guess that when that assembly that we saw on the front end was put on backwards, I'm going to guess that that was probably the replacement of the drags here. If you need drags, drags are still available. You can buy them through pennparts.com. If you just go on there, I believe they're fulfilled out of Scott's Bait and Tackle down in New Jersey. But regardless, they are available. That's the good point. So the first, your drag is a set of 7. It goes fabric, metal, with the ears, fabric, metal. So we're going to go put that eared one in now, and there's a little inset in the main gear that ear sits in. You want to make sure that you have it in there. And then here's the last of the drags, fabric drag. Now these have plenty of lubrication on them, so you don't need to lubricate this in this case, even though it looked like a lot of it got squeezed out, but they're fine. It's the lubrication that keeps them from becoming brittle. Should you need lubrication, there's a product out there. It's called Cal's Universal Reel and Star Drag Grease. It's a product that I use when I go and resend and rebuild them. So I'm just going to wipe this this excess grease off the collar washer, and we're ready to reassemble this side. Now, this is where I need to take my gloves off because it's small parts, and I want to show you how to reseat this with the dog. So we've previously done this assembly. The threaded screws go on the lower holes of the reel. The dog sits on top of that. I'm sorry. We want to take the assembly next, and we want to put that in, and about a 3/4 of a turn, holding that down with your thumb for the appropriate tension. Next thing we do is put the dog, we seat the dog on the screw and near the main gear, and then we go and get that little flat bar spring again. That's this one. Now this spring, there's a little post, and it goes between the post and the outer wall. It's seated properly here, and then you complete turning the gear assembly so that you hear that spool gear come through, and then you line the screw, tighten it just a few turns. You won't want to over tighten at this part. You want to make sure that the other screws are seated. So we're going to take this one next, which is a spring screw. It's only partially threaded, and I like to alternate them, much like torquing the lugs on a car. Go high and low, alternate sides. That way you know you're going to have your gear plate side properly aligned. So there we go with that, and then there's one more on the top. Again, it's that partially threaded screw. And once you get all 4 of them tightened, then you can go ahead and tighten them all down, which is what I'm doing here. Don't over tighten them, just make sure that they're snug. Some people have asked, do you put Loctite on them? I don't, because it makes it more difficult when you go to do it in the future. And then just turn, and you can hear that it's working, and you can see it's working fine. That's the anti-reverse. So the last part of lubrication I'd like to do on this one is to lube up the transition mechanism there. Check to make sure it's working well, which it is, and then back to the gloves. I'm going to put my gloves back on because I'm going to do a little bit of cleaning here. And when I clean, I like to keep the stuff off of my hands as best I can. So you can notice there's some minor corrosion on this reel, not inappropriate for the age of the reel. Overall, as we saw, it's in good condition, and it has been maintained over time, so it's not a bad reel to work on. I use my steel wool, my chrome cleaner, and I use that on the bright metal parts. So there's some corrosion here. We're just going to lightly buff it with the steel wool. The steel wool is a 4O, which is a very fine steel wool, and it's not going to mar up or otherwise damage the reel. It's simply going to bring out the bright chrome on that reel, and what a difference that makes just working with that. Same thing here. We could take these pieces off if we liked. I'm just going to clean these up for now. The proper way to maintain a reel after each time that you go fishing is to wash it down with fresh water. Do not use salt water. Salt water will take the greases and get rid of them. I've also heard of people that try and use like a soapy water, like a dish detergent. That's absolutely the wrong thing to do. The reason for that is that that will also dissolve the lubrication that you put in there, and you'll be worse off rather than better off for cleaning your reel that way. So I'm going to get rid of some of the old grease. I'm going to grease the bearing on the alternate side of the reel. And we're ready to reassemble. So we're going to take that spool, put the spool back on the reel, take the drive side plate, and then just simply align the holes. And again, there's two different size screws. The small screw, and again, the downside of these gloves is that working with small parts is not optimal. Alright, so small screws go in the bottom two holes that align with the reel seat. And you'll know that you made a mistake if the screw is sticking out here. And you don't want to use the long screws there because the line could loop and catch the long side of the screw that's protruding from the reel seat if you did it that way. So just make sure that you got the screws in the right holes. The screwdriver I'm using, if you're not familiar with this screwdriver, it's an electrician's screwdriver. It's got a rubber jacket on it so that when the electricians are working, if they hit a live wire, it doesn't spark. I happen to like this one because of the blade size is almost identical to the insets on these screws, and also when your wrists get tired, it's an easy grip to twist with. Alright, so two more screws for the side. The short one going to the reel seat. The long one going to the post screw over here. And then it's time to put the Star Dragon handle assembly back on. So we have the ferrule. You want to make sure the inside of the ferrule is clean. That goes next. I also like at this time to put a drop of oil on the pinion gear. I use a Real Oil, Real X. There's plenty of oils out there you could use, including 3-in-1 or any machine oil, as well as other real oils. And then let's put this Star Drag on. I'm going to clean this one up. This one has some crud on it, and as I mentioned, it was put on the wrong reverse way before. Should have cleaned these with my gloves on, but such is life. We're going to reassemble that. And then we'll put the handle back on, and again there's some little minor corrosion crud on there, so the steel wool will clean that up again. Then the handle nut goes on. Hand tighten as much as you can, and then the last twist or two you want to look to make sure that the groove on that handle nut is aligned with your screw hole so that you can put this screw set in. looks like I got that. Put the screw back. Now again, I'm working on a 155 Beachmaster, which was probably the most common. There's also a couple others in the series. The 160 would be the next one that would probably be behind that, and the 150 is the smallest. And you can hear the clickers working fine in this case. And there you go. We're reset. A good set of drags. I checked for spool tension. There's just a little bit of play there. Sometimes this nut gets over tightened, but this one's ready to go fishing again. So I hope that provides you some helpful hints in terms of how to work with these reels and how to work with that spring and fix that dog. So again, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. I hope that this video has been of value to you, and I encourage you to look at some of my other videos as well. Thanks again.